At 24, 11 months after the divorce was final, Tessa Moreau sat in a paneled conference room and watched her ex-husband's family divide 16 years of her life into columns on a page. They took the house, they took the accounts, they took the car she had made every payment on herself. Then Genevieve Whitcomb slid a folded deed across the table and smiled the way she smiled at waiters. A one-room house in an Ozark Hollow, 4 hours west, assessed by Vance County at $3. The room laughed. Adam looked at the floor. But Tessa drove those 4 hours, put an old brass key in an older lock. And behind those walls, she found the thing the Whitcombs had spent 46 years making sure nobody would ever look for. If you're still here with me, hit subscribe and stay to the end, because this story only makes sense when you see all of it. And drop the name of the city you're listening from in the comments. I want to see how far Tessa's story travels. The worst part was not the losing. Tessa had made her peace with losing somewhere around month 4 in a laundromat at 2 in the morning, folding scrubs that still smelled like the hospice wing. The worst part was that they made her sit there while they did it. 16 sheets of paper. She counted them because counting kept her hands still. 16 sheets, and Preston Whitcomb read every line aloud in a voice that had never once in his life been interrupted, and she was expected to nod at the end of each one like a woman agreeing to her own erasure. She was 19 when she signed the prenuptial agreement. That was the whole trick, and everyone in the room knew it. 19 in a conference room like this one, with Adam's hand on her shoulder and a lawyer across the table who kept saying, "This is standard, this is just standard," and no one, not one single person, sitting on her side. She had asked one question that day. She remembered it precisely the way you remember the last ordinary thing you said before something changed. She had asked, "Do I need my own lawyer?" And the Whitcomb attorney had laughed and said that would be like hiring a bodyguard to walk you across your own living room. 5 years later, she understood that the living room had never been hers. Preston kept reading. The lake property to the family trust, in which Tessa held no beneficial interest by operation of Section 4. The brokerage accounts to the family trust. The little rock house, the one she had painted room by room over 2 summers. The one where she had learned which stair creaked and how to make the back door close without waking anybody, to the family trust, on the grounds that the down payment had been gifted, and gifted assets and their appreciation remained separate property. The car went too. She had made 41 payments on that car out of hospice aid wages. It was titled to the trust because Preston had handled the paperwork as a wedding favor, and she had been 20 and grateful. Adam sat 2 chairs down from his mother and did not look up. Not once. He had a legal pad in front of him, and he had drawn nothing on it and written nothing on it, and he kept turning his pen over end to end, and Tessa found that she could not stop watching the pen. It was easier than watching his face. His face had a way of looking sorry that had stopped meaning anything to her sometime around the 2nd year. "Is there a 4th schedule?" Genevieve asked when Preston reached the end. "There is." "Then let's have it, please. I have a 2 o'clock. That was the thing about Genevieve Whitcomb. She never raised her voice. In 5 years, Tessa had never once heard her raise her voice, and she had come to understand that this was not gentleness. It was confidence. You don't raise your voice when nothing in the room can hurt you. Preston turned to the last page. Schedule D, conveyance to Tessa Ann Moreau, parcel 14, Quill Creek Township, Vance County, 4.1 acres, 1 single-room structure, no improvements of record. He paused, and Tessa understood later that the pause was rehearsed. County assessed value $3. Somebody at the far end of the table made a sound. It started as a cough and gave up halfway and became a laugh. And once one person laughed, the rest of them let themselves, because that's how it works. Nobody wants to be the only one laughing, and nobody wants to be the only one not. Genevieve reached into her handbag and set something on the polished wood and pushed it across with 2 fingers the way you'd push a plate you were done with. A brass key, heavy dark with age, a paper tag tied to the bow with string gone soft and brown. "Your share," she said. Tessa looked at the key. She did not pick it up. Some cold, careful part of her had already decided that she would not pick it up while they were watching, and she held to that with everything she had left. $3, Preston said, and he was enjoying himself now, which was rarer for him than for the young. "Mother, that might be the most generous thing this family's done all year." Adam's pen stopped turning. He didn't say anything. Tessa waited. She was ashamed afterward of how long she waited, of the fact that some idiot piece of her heart was still standing at that door knocking, and he didn't say anything, and then he started turning the pen again. "Are we finished?" Genevieve asked the attorney. "There's the acknowledgement." "Then let's acknowledge." Tessa signed her name 11 times. Her handwriting got worse each time, which embarrassed her, and the embarrassment was somehow the thing that finally put a crack in her. Not the house, not the money, not the laughing. Her own handwriting falling apart in front of them. Then she picked up the key because there was no one left to see her do it who mattered. She read the schedule in her car in the parking garage with the engine off and the windows up because she was not going to cry in a stairwell where a Whitcomb could walk past. She got to page 9 before she stopped breathing right. Right, 2 attachments. She'd assumed they were surveys. They weren't. Attachment 1, a statement of delinquent ad valorem taxes on parcel 14. Quill Creek Township in the amount of $2,140.16 with accrued penalties subject to the county's annual tax sale on the first Tuesday of November. Attachment 2, a notice of unfit structure issued by the Vance County Code Office, standing since March, requiring abatement or demolition at the owner's expense. Tessa sat there and read it twice, and then she laughed out loud alone in a concrete garage, and the sound of it scared her a little. It wasn't a gift. It was a bill. They hadn't given her $3 of dirt. They had given her a liability with a countdown on it, and they'd handed it over in front of a room full of people so it would look on the record like she'd walked away with something. 61 days. She counted it on her fingers against the dashboard. 61 days until Vance County sold the only thing she owned out from under her for $2,000 she did not have. Someone knocked on her window. Adam. Standing there with his tie loosened and his hands in his pockets, doing the thing he did with his mouth when he wanted to be forgiven for something he wasn't going to stop doing. She rolled the window down 4 inches. "Tess," he shifted his weight. "You know I didn't, that wasn't my call, any of it." "I know," she said. "That's the part I can't get past." "What does that mean?" "It means it was never your call, Adam. Not one single time in 5 years. You just sat there and let it be somebody else's call and then came out to the parking lot after." She put her hand on the ignition. "You've got a really good face for after." "I didn't have anything for that." She watched him not have anything for it, and then she rolled the window up and backed out, and in the mirror, he was still standing there in the empty space with his hands in his pockets. And she thought, that is exactly what he'll be doing in 10 years wherever he is. She would remember that thought later in a courthouse, and it would turn out she'd been wrong about him. But not for a long time yet. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom over a tire shop with a lease that ended Friday. She had $310. She counted it on the kitchen floor, the way she'd counted the signature pages because counting was the only thing that made her hands stop. $240 in cash from the envelope taped under the silverware drawer. $70 in the account, which she wouldn't touch because $70 in an account was the difference between broke and gone. She packed in under an hour, and it frightened her how little there was. 2 pairs of jeans, work shoes, scrubs because she was not going to be the kind of person who stopped showing up for shifts. A flannel her mother had left her, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and she bought new batteries for it at the gas station on the corner and standing at that counter paying $4 for batteries. She had a thought that she recognized as the first real decision of her adult life. If it's condemned, I'll see it condemned, but I'm gonna see it. She almost didn't go. That's the thing people leave out. She sat on the floor of that apartment until 11 at night with the key in her fist, and she came up with 9 good reasons to sell the parcel for whatever a junk land buyer would give her, 400, maybe 6, and take a room in Little Rock and go back to picking up shifts. What decided it was smaller than a reason? It was the paper tag on the key. Somebody had written on it a long time ago in pencil in small precise capitals, QC, shop, not cabin, not lot, not shack, shop. Somebody had once thought that building was a place where work got done. She left before dawn and drove west. She was fine for 2 hours. She had coffee and the radio in a road, and being on a road is its own kind of relief when you have nowhere to be. Then the interstate gave up and became a highway, and the highway gave up and became 2 lanes cut through hills that got steeper and closer. In around hour 3, she realized she had not seen another car in 11 minutes. The county road turned to gravel. The gravel turned to something the map still called a road out of politeness. Her phone lost signal in a way that felt personal, 4 bars, then one, then a little gray X, and she caught herself checking it 3 times in a mile like it was going to change its mind. A branch dragged across her roof with a sound like a fingernail down a chalkboard, and she said something out loud that would have made her mother laugh. And then the trees opened. She had spent 4 hours building the picture in her head, and she had built it carefully because she was a person who protected herself by expecting the worst on purpose. Collapsed roof, floor gone soft, animals in the walls. A cruelty she could take a photograph of and be angry about for the rest of her life. That is not what she was looking at. The porch was level. She stood at the bottom of the steps and looked down the length of that porch, and it was level. Dead level after however many decades, and Tessa did not know anything about building, but she knew what a floor looks like when it's been giving up for 40 years, and this floor had not been giving up. She went up the steps, and they didn't creak. That's what got her. Old porch steps creak. These took her weight and said nothing. The door was thick and dark, and the hinges were not store hinges. They were hand-cut, forged, and shaped and set flush. And she stood in front of that door with a $2,000 tax bill in her bag and thought absurdly, someone made these by hand for a house nobody was ever going to visit. She put the key in. She had prepared herself for this too, for the lock to be rusted shut, for the whole thing to be a last joke, for the key to be the wrong key entirely, which honestly would have been the most Whitcomb thing possible. It turned on the first try, smooth all the way around like it had been oiled that morning. Tessa stood there with her hand on that key and got the first cold feeling of the whole trip, and it was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of walking into a room and realizing you are not the first person to have planned this. She pushed the door open. The air inside was dry. That was wrong, and she knew it was wrong immediately. A sealed structure in an Ozark hollow humidity, like a wet towel 8 months a year, and the air in that room was dry and cool and smelled like cedar. And something else, something sharp and sweet she couldn't name yet, and would learn later, was spruce resin. She got the flashlight up. One room. She'd been told one room, and it was one room, but the walls were not walls the way a shack has walls. Every board was planed, not sanded planed, so that the surface caught the beam and gave it back with a kind of depth. And the boards were matched. She didn't have the vocabulary yet, but she had eyes, and she could see that the grain ran out of one board and into the next like a sentence continuing across a page break. Somebody had stood in that room and chosen the order of every board. Against the north wall was a bench. She walked to it and put her hand on it, and it did not move at all. Not a shiver, not a settle. She got down and put the light underneath and saw why the legs weren't legs. They were posts, and they went through the floorboards and were bolted into the joists. That bench wasn't furniture. It was part of the building. Somebody had built a house around a table. The top of it was worn into a shallow dish. In one place, the way stone steps were in the exact spot where a person's forearms would rest if they leaned in over close work. 10,000 hours of leaning made that dish. Maybe more. Tessa put her own arms in it. She didn't decide to. She was just standing there, and her body did it, and she had to straighten up fast because her eyes went hot, and she was not going to cry in front of an empty room after not crying in front of a full one. She found the ladder at the back and went up into the loft, and that is where the night stopped making any sense at all. The loft was stacked with wood. Narrow strips, none of them wider than her hand, laid in courses with thin sticks between each layer, so the air could move the whole stack, squared up and tied and labeled. She pulled one strip out. It was light, unbelievably light, and when she flicked it with a fingernail, it made a small, clear sound like a struck glass. There were tags on the stacks. Pencil, the same small capitals as the key. S. Spruce End Slope Cut 1168. Do not sell. Maple Figured Cut 371. Do not sell. S. Spruce Cut 974. Do not sell. She counted 11 stacks. She counted them twice, sitting up there with the flashlight in her teeth, and it took her a while to understand what she was actually looking at, and when it landed hard. Somebody had spent 30 years cutting and curing wood in a building the county said was worth $3 and had written "do not sell" on every single stack and had never come back for any of it. She slept on the floor in the sleeping bag because she was not going to lie down on anything of his until she knew whose it was. Around 2 in the morning, the wind came down the hollow. It came in a long push, the way mountain wind does, and the house did not rattle. It didn't shudder or groan or make any of the noises a house makes when it's losing an argument with weather. It hummed, one note, low and even and clean, coming from somewhere up in the roofline, holding for as long as the wind held and then fading with it. Tessa sat straight up in the dark with her heart going like a bird in a box. She got the flashlight on. Nothing. She waited. The wind came again and the note came with it. The same note, the exact same note, and she sat there in a sleeping bag on the floor of a $3 house with her arms around her knees and said out loud to nobody, "What are you?" Bah. The town was 11 miles down and called Quill Creek. Gas station, hardware store, a diner, a post office that shared a wall with a church. She went into the hardware store for a broom and cleaner and rags because those were things she understood. And a heavy-set man behind the counter looked up over reading glasses on a chain and said good morning like he meant it. "I need cleaning supplies," Tessa said. "I just moved into a place up the hollow." "Whereabouts?" "Parcel 14, off the gravel past where the road stops being a road." He was reaching for a broom when she said it, and his hand did not come back down. It stayed up there for a second and a half. She counted it later. She was that sure of it, and then it came down and picked up the broom and set it on the counter. "Whose place did you say?" he asked. "I didn't, but the deed says Whitcomb." The store got very quiet. There was a woman in the back aisle with a can of paint, and Tessa heard her stop moving. "Silas," the man said. "Sorry. Silas Whitcomb." He said the name carefully like a man setting down something he hasn't held in a while. That was his shop. "Did you know him?" He took a long time with that. He rang up the broom. He rang up the rags. He put a bottle of cleaner in the bag she hadn't asked for and didn't charge her for it. "Everybody in this valley knew Silas," he said. "That's $12. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." And that was all. He would not say one more word about it. She stood there and tried twice more, and he answered her the way people answer when they've had a lot of practice answering a long time ago. "I couldn't tell you before my time, really." And he was 65 years old, and it had plainly not been before his time at all. Walking out to her car, Tessa understood something that would take her another 3 weeks to prove she had not walked into a mystery. She had walked into an agreement. A whole town had agreed on something a long time ago, and the agreement was silence, and she had just violated it by saying a name out loud in a hardware store on a Tuesday morning. So she cleaned for 3 days because it was the only thing she could do that cost nothing. There is a kind of grief that only comes out through your hands. Tessa had seen it in hospice daughters who couldn't sit still, who alphabetized their dying mother's spice rack at midnight, and she had always thought of it as something that happened to other people. Now she swept a floor that didn't need sweeping and wiped walls until her shoulders burned, and did not let herself stop, because the second she stopped, the whole thing came up at once: the conference room, the laugh, the pen turning over and over her own name in her own bad handwriting 11 times. On the second day, wiping down the underside of the bench, she found it burned into the wood where nobody would ever see it standing up. SW, and under it 4 rows of tally marks. Small vertical cuts grouped in 5s made at different times with different pressure. She counted them on her back on the floor with the flashlight propped on her chest. 11. 11 marks under a workbench in a building with 11 stacks of wood in the loft, and Tessa Moreau lay there on that floor for a long minute, with her heart doing something complicated, because she was starting to get the shape of a thought, and the thought was he was counting something. He finished 11 of something, and then he stopped. On the 4th day, she drove down for water and a phone signal, and her phone rang in the diner parking lot before she'd even finished charging it. A Little Rock number. "Ms. Moreau, my name's Doug Renner. I'm with Renner and Feld. We do some work for the Whitcomb family interests." Tessa put her coffee down on the roof of her car. "I'm going to save you the trouble," she said. "The settlement's signed. There's nothing left to take." "No, ma'am, nothing like that. This is actually good news for you." He had a warm voice. That was the part she thought about afterward, how warm it was. "There's a party interested in acquiring the Quill Creek parcel. Clean cash offer, quick close. They'd take it as is and assume the delinquency. $4,000. She said nothing. "Miss Moreau, you're offering me $4,000, she said slowly. "For a piece of property your clients told a room full of lawyers was worth 3. He laughed like they were friends. "Well, assessed value's not market value. 4 days ago, they laughed at me for it, Mr. Renner. There were 9 people in that room, and every one of them laughed. I wasn't in that room. No, but somebody made a phone call the same week, and it wasn't to apologize. She could hear her own voice going hard and steady, and she did not recognize it. And some distant part of her was standing back, saying, "Look at that. Look what you can do. Tell them no." Ms. Moreau, that tax sale is in 57 days. If you can't cure the delinquency, the county takes it, and you get nothing. 4,000 is, tell them no. She hung up. Then she sat down on the curb outside the diner because her legs had gone strange, and she held her coffee in both hands, and she made herself think it all the way through instead of just feeling it. They knew about the tax sale. Obviously, they'd attached the statement themselves, but they had put that liability in her hands on purpose in public with a laugh, and then inside of 4 days, somebody had gone looking for a lawyer to buy it back. You don't do that with worthless land. You do that with land you need to move. And Tessa Moreau, 24 years old, $310 to her name, sitting on a curb in a town that wouldn't say a dead man's name out loud, felt something come up through her that she had not felt in 11 months and had honestly thought she was done with. She wanted to know. Not to win, not yet. She just wanted with her whole chest to know. On the way back up, she passed a mailbox she hadn't noticed, and a woman in the yard beside it straightened up from a raised bed and raised one gloved hand. Tessa slowed. She almost stopped. She was still deciding when the woman called out across 30 feet of yard, in the clear, caring voice of somebody who had spent 40 years running a classroom, "You're the one up at Silas's shop." It was not a question, and it was not the hardware store, and it was the first time anyone in that valley had said the name to her instead of past her. "I am," Tessa called back. The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled off the other glove and said, "You'll want to come down for coffee before you go poking behind that fireplace." Tessa's foot came off the gas entirely. Why the fireplace? But the woman had already turned back to her garden bed, the way old women do when they've decided the conversation will happen on their schedule. And Tessa sat there idling in the road for a good 20 seconds before she drove on. She went back that night with every intention of waiting until morning, and she lasted about 90 minutes. The wind came down the hollow around 10, and the house hummed its one note, and she lay in the sleeping bag, listening to it, and thought about a workbench bolted through the floor, and 11 stacks of wood marked "Do Not Sell," and 11 tally marks burned where nobody would look, and a lawyer with a warm voice offering $4,000 for $3 of dirt. She got up. She got the flashlight and the bucket and a rag, and she started on the hearth, and she told herself it was because the hearth was filthy and she was going to be here a while. The stones were fitted tight. That was the thing about that whole building. Everything in it was fitted tight. She worked the rag into the joints along the base and around the sides, and she was not looking for anything. She genuinely was not. She was a woman scrubbing at midnight because scrubbing beat lying in the dark. Then the rag caught. It caught and stopped on the left side, about knee height, and Tessa sat back on her heels and brought the light in close. There was a line. It ran up the edge of one stone straight, clean top to bottom. She put her thumbnail in it. Stone doesn't crack straight. Stone cracks the way it wants to and fits and jags. And this line went from the mortar at the bottom to the mortar at the top without one single deviation. And she followed it up with the light and found where it turned 90 degrees and ran horizontal. Not a crack, a cut. Tessa's mouth had gone completely dry. She set the flashlight down on the floor so the beam ran sideways across the stones and put both hands flat against that section and pushed. Nothing. She braced her feet and put her shoulder into it and pushed harder with everything she had. And just as she was about to quit, just as she was thinking you're a fool on your knees in the dark, the stone gave. Half an inch inward. Then it moved sideways, smooth, easy, silent on something behind it that had been machined by hand and had waited decades to be asked. And a section of that hearth the size of a bread box slid open in front of her. Cold air came out, cold and dreary and smelling of cedar. Tessa did not move for 4 or 5 full seconds. Her hands were shaking. She got the flashlight up off the floor, and it took her 2 tries to point it into the gap. There was something in there. Long, wrapped in oilcloth, gone dark with age, and tied with a leather cord in a knot. Somebody's fingers had made a long time ago. She reached in with both hands, and the reaching was the longest 10 inches of her life, and her fingers closed around it and lifted. It came out easily. It was narrow, it was hollow, and it weighed almost nothing at all. The oilcloth had been wrapped in 3 turns, and the leather cord had gone stiff enough that she had to work the knot loose with a fingernail. And the whole time her hands were shaking so badly, she had to stop twice and press them flat against her thighs. She got the cord off. She peeled back the first fold. Wood. Dark glowing red-brown under the flashlight, and a curve to it that no piece of firewood in the world has ever had. She peeled back the second fold and the third, and then Tessa Moreau was sitting on the floor of a $3 house at midnight, holding a violin. It had no strings. 4 pegs of bridge lying loose inside the body where it had fallen sometime in the last 50 years, and a fingerboard black as a piano key. The varnish had gone amber and deep, and it took the flashlight the way water takes light, and she turned it over, and the back was a single piece of maple with a figure in it, like wind moving across a wheat field. She had held a violin exactly once in her life, in 5th grade, for about 90 seconds before a music teacher took it away from her and gave it to a boy whose parents could afford the rental. She turned it and looked into the F-hole, and there was a paper label inside, and she had to get the light at exactly the right angle, and when she finally read it, she said the words out loud in an empty room, because there was no other way to make them real. Silas Whitcomb, Quill Creek, 1968. She sat with it in her lap for a long time, long enough that the flashlight started to yellow at the edges. Then she got up, still holding it, and she looked at that hearth, at the one stone she'd found out of the 40 or 50 that made up the face of it, and a thought arrived in her chest with the force of a hand shoving her. He wouldn't have built a secret door for one. She went and at the rest of the hearth on her hands and knees for 2 hours. She pressed every stone. She dragged her thumbnail through every joint. Her fingertips split open along the sides, and she wrapped them in a rag and kept going, and around 3 in the morning, she found a second seam, 18 inches to the right of the first, and she pushed it, and it did not move, and she pushed it harder, and it did not move, and she pushed it until she was crying with frustration, and it did not move. She fell asleep on the floor next to it with the violin beside her, and when she woke up, she had not moved, and her hand was still on the stone. She drove down the hollow at 8 in the morning with the violin in the passenger seat buckled in with the seatbelt, which she knew was insane and did anyway. The mailbox with the raised beds was 2 miles down. The woman was already out there at that hour in gloves, and she straightened up when Tessa's car stopped, and she did not say hello. She looked at the passenger seat. "Bring it in," she said. Her name was Odessa Lindquist, 78 years old, 31 of them, teaching 6th grade in a school that had since closed, and she had a kitchen table with a checkered cloth on it, and she cleared that table with one sweep of her forearm before Tessa had both feet in the door. "Put it here. Not there. Here." Tessa set it down. Odessa did not touch it for almost a minute. She stood over that table with her hands at her sides and looked at it the way people look at a coffin at a viewing. And Tessa stood by the door and did not breathe. And finally the old woman put one finger on the scroll and then ran it down the neck to the body. "Where?" Odessa said. "Behind the fireplace. There's a stone that slides." "A stone that slides," Odessa laughed. "It came out wrong, cracked in the middle." "Of course there is. Of course there is, you stubborn old man." She went to a hall closet and came back with a case of her own, a plain black student case beat to death. And she took out a violin that was nothing at all next to the one on the table, and she started pulling the strings off it one at a time. "What are you doing?" "Fitting strings." Her hands were fast and certain and 40 years out of practice, and it didn't matter. "It's got no sound post. God knows where the sound post went. It'll sound like a shoebox. It'll sound like a shoebox, and you'll still hear it." She set the bridge. She threaded the strings and turned the peg, and the pegs turned smooth, and she brought each one up slow. Listening, adjusting, and Tessa watched an old woman's hands do something they had clearly done 10,000 times and stopped doing for a reason nobody had told her yet. Then Odessa put it under her chin and drew the bow across it. Tessa had prepared herself for a nice sound. That was as far as her imagination went, because she had no vocabulary for anything past nice. What came out of that violin filled the kitchen and pushed against the walls and did not stop at the walls. It was too big for the room. It was too big for the house. It was one note, one long open note, and it kept going after Odessa lifted the bow hanging in the air for a second and a half like it hadn't been told to quit. Odessa lowered the instrument. She sat down in a kitchen chair very suddenly, the way people sit down when their legs make the decision, and she put her hand over her mouth and held it there. Are you all right? No, the old woman's eyes were streaming, and her voice was perfectly steady, which was somehow worse. No, honey, I am not all right. I have not been all right since 1979, and I have gotten very, very good at it. She made coffee because that's what you do with your hands when your hands need a job. Silas Whitcomb came into this valley in 1954 with a wife named Ruth and $400, she said. He cleared that land himself, 210 acres up and over the north slope, all of it with a mule and a crosscut saw and a bad back. Everything you drove past on your way in the timber, the bottom fields, that whole shelf of it, that was Silas. Tessa set her cup down. 210 acres. 210. I own 4. You own 4? Odessa agreed. That's the story. That's the whole story right there, and it took his boys about 11 months to write it. His boys. Marcus and Dale. Marcus was Genevieve's husband before he died. Dale is Preston's daddy, still alive, still in a very nice place in Hot Springs, where I hope he sleeps just wonderfully. She said it flat. They got educated. That was the thing everybody said about them at the time. Everybody in this valley was so proud. The Whitcomb boys, look at them, university business degrees. And then they came home in '79 with papers. What papers? That is exactly the question. Odessa looked at her over the cup. That is exactly the question nobody in this valley has asked out loud in 46 years, and I want you to understand something before you ask it again. There were maybe 60 families in Quill Creek at that time. Silas hired half of them at some point. He fixed things for the other half and wouldn't take money. And when his sons took his land, there was not one single person, including me sitting right here, who stood up and said one word. Why not? Because by 1980, the Whitcombs owned the mill, and by '84, they owned the bank paper on 9 farms, and by '90, they owned the road contracts. She set her cup down. And because it was legal, that's the part that finished us. They came in with a stamp and a signature, and it was all legal. And once a thing is legal, honey, people find they had nothing to say about it after all. Tessa thought about our conference room, about 9 people who laughed because the first one laughed. What happened to him? He walked up to that shop. Odessa's voice finally moved. He was 51 years old. He walked up the hollow to that little building he'd put up as a workshop, and he stayed there until he died in 2012, 33 years. Alone. Ruth died in '81, bad heart, and I have my opinions about what made it bad. She stood up and rinsed her cup at the sink with her back turned. I brought him bread and coffee the first Saturday of every month for 29 years. He never once asked me to. He never once said thank you in a way you'd recognize. And in 29 years, that man did not say his sons' names to me one time. Odessa. Tessa's voice came out low. How many instruments did he make? The old woman turned around from the sink. None, she said. What? That is the answer everybody in this valley would give you. He was a woodworker. He fixed chairs. He made a hope chest for the Bowman girls' wedding and a set of shelves for the church, and he never in 33 years showed or played one instrument for one living soul. And I have been in that shop, honey. Twice I stood in that room. Her chin came up and it was trembling. And that thing on my table has been sitting inside a wall 8 feet from where I stood for 50 years. The truck was in her clearing when she got back. Tessa saw it from 100 yards down and her whole stomach went to water because a truck meant people. And in her experience of the last 11 months, people arriving unannounced meant paperwork. A man was on her porch with a cordless drill and a stack of plywood leaning against the railing. She was out of the car before it had properly stopped. What are you doing? He turned around. Mid-30s forearms, like fence posts, a county work order folded and stuck in his shirt pocket where she could see it, and he had the look of a man who had done this exact conversation many times and had never once enjoyed it. Ma'am, you can't be up here. I own this. He stopped. He pulled the work order out and looked at it and then at her. You're Moreau, I'm Moreau. Well, he rubbed the back of his neck. That's a hell of a thing because as of Tuesday morning, the county's got this structure on the abatement list, and my job is to secure it pending demolition, and nobody at that office told me it had a live owner standing in the yard. Then somebody at that office is lying to you. That happens, he said without any heat at all, and she found that she disliked how much she immediately liked that answer. His name was Elias Boone. He did restoration work up and down 3 counties and took the county contracts in the slow months because a man has to eat. He'd been given the address that morning. He had already drilled 4 screws into her front door frame. "Take them out, ma'am. Take them out." Her voice cracked on the second word, and she hated that. That door frame is hand cut. Every hinge on that door was made by hand by a man who is dead and can't make another one. And you put 4 screws through it before 8 in the morning without knocking. Elias Boone looked at her for a second. Then he crouched down and looked at the door frame. Really looked. He put his thumb on the joint where the frame met the jamb and moved it slowly along the line, and Tessa watched his face change by degrees. And it was the same change she'd watched go across Odessa Lindquist's face over a kitchen table, and she was starting to understand that this building had been quietly doing this to people for 60 years, and nobody had ever been allowed to talk about it. He stood up. "Who built this?" "Silas Whitcomb." He didn't react to the name. He was still looking at the frame. "That's a wedged-through mortise. Nobody does that on a jam. Nobody's done that on a jam since about 1910 because it takes 4 hours and no one can see it once it's up." He turned. "Can I see inside?" "Why buy? Because I've been in maybe 600 old buildings in this state," he said, "and I have never once had one of them make me want to apologize to it." She let him in. He stood in the middle of that room for a long time without touching anything, which she noted. Then he went to the north wall and got down and looked at the bench legs going through the floorboards into the joists, and he said something under his breath, and she asked him what, and he said, "Never mind." "Where's the rest of it?" he asked. "The rest of what?" "A shop like this." He gestured at nothing at all of it. "This is a bench for close work. That's a lamp mount, that hook there. That wall's got mounting holes in a pattern I don't recognize. Where are the tools? Where's the stock? Where's the He stopped. "There's a loft. There's 11 stacks of cured wood in that loft," Tessa said, "and every one of them says do not sell." Elias Boone turned around and looked at her, and it was the first time he'd looked at her instead of the building. "Miss Moreau," he said, "what exactly is in this house?" She thought about it for 2 full seconds. Later, she would think that everything turned on those 2 seconds, and she was never able to explain even to herself why she decided the way she did. She went to the hearth and she put her hand on the stone, and she pushed. I didn't say a word for 4 minutes. She timed it on her phone afterward out of pure disbelief. He didn't ask to hold the violin. He asked if he could, and then he held it the way you hold a newborn from underneath, and he turned it into the window light and looked at the back and the ribs and the scroll and the long-dried varnish, and his jaw was working. "I apprenticed for a luthier in Memphis," he said. 3 years. I was 22 and I thought I was going to be something." He turned it again. "I quit because I was never going to be able to do work like this, and I was honest enough with myself to know it at 25 instead of 45. "Is it good?" He laughed one short, disbelieving breath. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand what you're standing in. This isn't a shop where a man made a violin." He set it down on the bench with 2 hands. "This is a shop where a man made violins for 30 years and never let one leave the room." "There's a second seam," Tessa said, "in the hearth. It won't open." "Show me." She showed him. He put his palm on it and pushed the way she had pushed, and nothing happened, and then he did something she hadn't thought to do. He pressed the stone above it, first and held it, and then pushed, and the second compartment slid open like it had been waiting all night to be asked politely. Tessa said a word that would have gotten her sent out of Odessa Lindquist's 6th-grade classroom. Inside was a viola, bigger, darker, wrapped the same way, tied the same way, and there was a small square of paper folded under the cord, and Tessa opened it with her split fingertips. No. 4, finish 371. Nobody heard it. SW. She had to sit down on the floor. "Nobody heard it," she said. "He wrote that down," Elias said. He was still on his knees. He finished it, and he wrote down that nobody heard it. "That's not a..." He stopped and started again. "That's not a maker's note. That's a man keeping score." 11, Tessa said. "What?" "There's 11 tally marks burned into the underside of that bench." She was already getting up. "And 11 stacks in the loft." He was counting. "Shero." They found the 3rd that afternoon, and it nearly killed them both. It was Elias who worked out that the loft floorboards ran a different direction over one 4-foot section, and Tessa who realized the section didn't lift but slid once you took the pressure off it. And when they got it open, there was a cello in there on its side, packed in wool and cedar shavings, and it had been in that hole in the dark since before either of them was born. Tessa sat down on the loft floor next to it and put both hands over her face and cried for the first time in 11 months, and it was not about the cello, and both of them knew it. Elias Boone did not touch her and did not say anything and did not leave. He sat down about 4 feet away and waited it out, and when she was done, he handed her a shop rag and said, "That's a clean one," and she laughed so hard she started crying again. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I don't cry. Ma'am, I quit a trade I loved because I was scared of not being good enough at it, and I've thought about it every day for 10 years. He stood up and put his hand out and pulled her to her feet. "You're going to have to try harder than that to embarrass yourself around me." Under the cello, wedged flat against the joist, were the ledgers. Not journals. Not yet. 4 thin books, and they were the least dramatic thing in that entire building, and they turned out to be the hinge the whole story swung on. They were timber ledgers, columns, dates, species, board feet, slope, cut, cure. Silas Whitcomb had written down every single piece of wood he had ever taken off that mountain from 1955 forward in hands so small and precise it looked printed. Tessa sat at the bench with a flashlight and went through them for 6 hours while Elias got the roof flashing patched because he had at some point, without announcing it, stopped being a man with a demolition contract and started being a man on a ladder. At 2 in the morning, she found March of 1979. March 9, signing the papers the boys brought. Timber management, they said. Man came with them to stamp it. Stamp was worn near through. Marcus did the talking. Dale would not look at me. She read it 11 times. Then she read the next line dated 4 days later, and the next line was the reason she did not sleep at all that night. March 13th, went to the courthouse. Would not give me a copy. Said I would have to ask my son. The Vance County Clerk's office opened at 8:30, and Tessa Moreau was in the parking lot at 7:50. She had never done anything like this in her life. She had never so much as looked at a deed. She sat in that car for 40 minutes with her hands on the wheel and told herself out loud the way she used to talk patience through a bad hour. You can read, you can count, and you are not leaving until you understand it. The clerk was a woman about 50 with a lanyard and the flat, unbothered patience of somebody who had explained the same 4 things every day for 20 years. I need the deed books for Quill Creek Township, 1978 and 79. You a title company? No, ma'am, I'm an owner. That got her a second look. But it also got her the books in a table by the window, and Tessa Moreau spent 11 hours in that room over 2 days doing the least cinematic work of her entire life, and it was the work that broke the whole thing open. She learned the vocabulary as she went. She wrote definitions on the back of a gas receipt. Grantor is the one who gives. Grantee is the one who gets. Quitclaim means I give you whatever I've got, and I don't promise I've got anything. Traced parcel 14 backward through 50 years of transfers, and she found the shape of it on the second afternoon, and the shape was this: 210 acres went in one instrument on one day in April of 1979 from Silas Whitcomb to a partnership, and the partnership became a company, and the company became a trust, and the trust became the Whitcomb family holdings in every single thing that family had: the lake property, the Little Rock house, Preston's boat. The car she had made 41 payments on was downstream of one piece of paper signed by an exhausted 51-year-old man who was told it was about timber. And out of 210 acres, 4.1 had been carved off and left behind. Parcel 14, the shop, left in Silas Whitcomb's name for 33 more years. Tessa sat in that clerk's office with her finger on the page and thought, why would you leave 4 acres and then immediately after colder you wouldn't? Not unless leaving it was cheaper than taking it. She got 2 phone calls that week. The first was Renner, the warm-voiced lawyer, and this time the number was 11,000. That's a significant improvement, Miss Moreau, and I'd encourage you to. Last week it was 4. Markets move. Mr. Renner. She was standing in the diner parking lot again, in the one place in that valley with signal, and she was so calm she frightened herself. Nothing about a 4-acre lot in an Ozark Hollow moved $7,000 in 9 days. Tell me what's on it. Ms. Moreau, tell me what's on it, and I'll consider the offer. There was a pause on that line that lasted about 2 seconds, and it told her more than any answer would have. I'd hate to see you lose it at a tax sale for nothing, he said. That's the second time you've mentioned that sale, Tessa said. You want to know what I keep thinking about? You've mentioned it twice, and I've never once told you I couldn't pay. She hung up. The second call was Adam. She almost didn't answer. She let it go twice and picked up on the third because some things you don't get to be brave about. Tess, he sounded exactly the same, which she had not expected and did not care for. Are you actually up there? Mom said you were actually up there. Your mother's talking about me. He stopped. Look, Preston's been in her office 3 times this week. Something's going on, and it's about that property, and I don't know what it is, and I'm telling you because I thought you should know. Tessa closed her eyes. Adam, yeah, you went up there as a kid, didn't you? The silence went on long enough that she checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Every summer, he said finally, from when I was 7 till I was 11. I took the bus to Quill Creek and walked the last 2 miles, and my dad found out, and that was the end of it. You never told me. No. 5 years, Adam, you never told me you had a grandfather. His voice did something. They didn't talk about him. You don't understand what it's like growing up in a house where a person is just not a subject. You learn it before you can even. I understand it fine, Tessa said. I lived in that house for 5 years, and by the end I wasn't a subject either. She hung up on him too. She sat in her car afterward and shook, and she was not proud of the shaking or the hanging up, and she also did not take it back. She went back to the clerk's office on Friday for one reason, and the reason was small and nagging and had been chewing on her since the parking lot. Nothing about that lot moved $7,000 in 9 days. She asked the woman with the lanyard for the tax rolls. How far back? All of it. Honey, that's microfiche after 98. Then I'll use the microfiche. She was in that room 9 hours. Her eyes burned. Her back seized up. She rolled through decades of a county's payment history, one frame at a time, on a machine older than she was, and she wrote numbers on the back of the same gas receipt until she ran out of receipt and started on a napkin. And here is what she found, and it changed everything. Parcel 14 had never been delinquent. Not once, not in 31 years. Every November from 1980 forward, somebody paid the taxes on that 4 acres. Small money, $40, $60, $90, as the years went on. Paid on time every single year, right through Silas Whitcomb's death in 2012, and right on through 11 years after it, while a dead man's name sat on the title, and nobody in that family had so much as driven up the road. And then it stopped. The last payment was 14 months ago. Tessa sat back from that machine and did the arithmetic and felt the floor tilt because 14 months ago was the month she filed. She got up so fast the chair went over. Ma'am, the clerk looked up. You all right? Who paid it? Tessa's voice came out strange. The payments. Is there a payer of record? There's a remitter field sometimes. Depends what year. The woman came around the counter and she must have seen something in Tessa's face because she didn't ask another question. She just pulled the frame up herself and scrolled and put her finger on the screen. There, that's your remitter. It was not a person. It was a company. 6 letters and an LLC and nothing else, a name so deliberately boring that Tessa read it 3 times before it went in. Can I find out who that is? Secretary of State. It's online, honey. It's free. Anybody can look it up. The clerk was already writing the website on a sticky note. Registered agent will be right on the front page. Takes about 10 seconds. It took 9. She did it standing at the counter on her phone with the clerk watching, and the page loaded, and there was the company in good standing, registered in the state of Arkansas in November of 1980, and there under it was the line for the registered agent and the address for service of process. Tessa Moreau stared at that screen and heard her own blood in her ears. Because for 31 years, quietly every single November, somebody in that family had reached out and paid the tax on a worthless 4 acres. They had never visited and never mentioned and had laughed at in a conference room in front of 9 people. They hadn't forgotten this place. They had been maintaining it. And the name on the registered agent line in plain black letters on a public website that any person in America could read for free was Preston Whitcomb. It took the judge 4 minutes to get that room seated, and when he did not go back to the motion. Counselor, he said to Renner, I'm going to give you a chance to withdraw the expedited sale request before I rule on it, because I'll tell you plainly what I'm looking at. Your clients came into my courtroom and asked me to accelerate a tax sale on a parcel their own registered agent has been quietly funding for 31 years. Nobody mentioned that to me. Miss Moreau mentioned it to me. Renner said something about the remitter records being a matter of public record. They surely are, the judge said. That's how a 24-year-old with no lawyer found them in 9 seconds on her telephone. Sit down. He denied the motion to expedite from the bench. He set the conversion petition for a full evidentiary hearing. And then he did the thing nobody in that room had expected, including Tessa. He issued a temporary order, freezing the tax sale entirely pending resolution, and directed the county code office to produce every document generated on parcel 14 in the past 24 months, including the name of the inspector who had photographed the interior in March. Genevieve Whitcomb's chin came up half an inch when he said that. It was the only thing Tessa saw her do all morning. Oh, hey. The hallway afterward was the worst 40 seconds of the whole business. People wanted to touch her. That was the part she hadn't braced for. Hands on her shoulders, on her back, a woman she'd never met, gripping her forearm and saying, good girl, over and over, like a prayer. And Tessa standing there in the middle of it, with her manila folder against her chest, unable to feel any of it. Then the crowd opened, and Adam was in front of her. Preston had already gone. Genevieve had already gone. Adam had come out of that courtroom alone, and nobody in the hallway would look at him, which Tessa found she understood too well to enjoy. Tess, don't. I'm not asking for anything. I know. Her voice came out flat and exhausted. That's what makes it hard. If you were asking for something, I'd know what to do with it. He nodded. He got his phone out and put it away twice while standing there. They cut me off in the parking lot, he said. Preston did it before we got to the cars. I'm off the firm's counsel list. I'm out of the trust as a discretionary beneficiary, and my lease in Little Rock is on a building my uncle's partnership owns. A short, awful laugh. So that's fast. Adam, I'm not telling you so you'll feel bad. I'm telling you because I want somebody to know it happened, and there's nobody left to tell. He rubbed his face. God, that's pathetic. It's not pathetic. It is a little. Tessa stood there with a folder against her chest and 46 years of somebody else's silence between them, and she said the truest thing she had. You should have said it in 1979. I was 11. You should have said it 11 months ago. And Adam Whitcomb, who had never in 5 years of marriage let a sentence land on him without softening it, first looked her in the eye and said, yes, I should have. It didn't fix anything. She wanted to be clear with herself about that then and later. But it was the first time he had ever put both feet on the ground in front of her, and she would not pretend afterward that it cost her nothing to watch. Thank you, she said, for today. Don't thank me for doing the bare minimum 4 decades late. I'm not. She turned to go, and then she turned back. I'm thanking you because you knew exactly what it was going to cost, and you walked through the door anyway. That's the only part that ever counts. The next 11 weeks were not dramatic, and they were the hardest work of her life. She got a lawyer, finally the woman in Fayetteville, who called her 2 days after the hearing and said, well, hell, and took the case on a contingency she wrote out on a napkin. She got a title examiner. She got a forensic document examiner out of Memphis, who looked at the carbon under magnification for 2 hours and produced a 9-page report that said what Tessa had said in 11 words only with citations. And she learned the thing that she had been avoiding, learning which was that she was not going to get the mountain back. Her lawyer sat her down and told her straight. The 1979 deed was defective. Nobody was going to argue otherwise anymore. But it had been recorded for 46 years, and Arkansas had statutes of limitation and doctrines of laches, and a whole architecture built specifically to stop courts from unwinding 46 years of transfers, and downstream of that deed were 9 farms and a school district and about 200 innocent purchasers who had bought in good faith. If we win everything, the lawyer said, we get parcel 14 confirmed, we get the contents confirmed, and we get a referral out to the Secretary of State on the notarial record. That's it. 210 acres is gone, honey. It was gone in 1979. Tessa took a day with that. She sat on the porch of a shop that a man had built with his hands and let herself be furious. Then she called her lawyer back. Take the referral, she said. That's the one I want. That's the smallest one. No, it isn't. Tessa was watching the road. The land's just land. That referral puts the words fraudulent acknowledgement on a state record with the Whitcomb name attached forever where any bank or any board or any newspaper can pull it. They don't lose the acres. They lose the story. Her lawyer was quiet for a second. "You are a genuinely frightening person," she said, "and I'm glad you're on my side." It worked faster than anybody expected, and it worked because of the county code office. The judge's production order turned up the March inspection file, and the inspection file had a photo log, and the photo log had 41 interior images of a structure that no inspector should have been inside, and it had a name. The inspector's name was Wade Pruitt. He had been with the county for 6 years. He was subpoenaed, and he came in with his own lawyer, and he folded in about 9 minutes. He had been asked to look at parcel 14 as a favor. He had been asked to take pictures of anything unusual. He had been told the family was thinking about restoring it. He had put the condemnation on the fast track because he was told the family wanted the liability cleared, and he had never once in 6 years thought to ask why a family that wanted to restore a building would want it condemned. "Mr. Pruitt," Tessa's lawyer said, "who asked you?" He said, "Preston Whitcomb." And that not the deed, not the notary, not Adam on the stand was the thing that ended it. Because a 46-year-old fraud is history, and a county employee taking direction from a private party 14 months ago is a live matter in the county attorney's office does not have a family loyalty problem. The Whitcombs settled 8 days later. They withdrew the conversion petition with prejudice. They paid the delinquency and the penalties and the code office fees. They released all claims to the contents of parcel 14 in writing permanently. They agreed to a stipulated finding that the 1979 acknowledgement was defective as to parcel 14. And they did not admit a single other thing, and they did not apologize. And Tessa's lawyer told her to sign it, and she signed it. The referral went out to the Secretary of State's office on a Thursday. The bank pulled the Whitcomb development line of credit on the following Tuesday. Preston resigned from 2 boards inside a month. One of them a hospital. A regional paper ran 900 words under a headline that used the word forged, and after that, it did not matter what any court had held about statutes of limitation because the Valley had already held its own hearing and reached its own verdict, and the Valley did not have a limitations period. Genevieve Whitcomb came up the hollow alone in December. Tessa saw the car from the porch and did not go inside and did not stand up. She had spent 5 years standing up when that woman entered a room, and she had recently decided she was finished with it. Genevieve came across the yard in shoes that were entirely wrong for it and stopped at the bottom of the steps, which put her for the first time in the history of the two of them lower than Tessa. "May I come up?" "You can say what you came to say from there." Genevieve absorbed that without a flicker. "I'd like to see inside." "No, Tessa." "No." She let it sit. "You had 33 years while he was alive and 11 more after he died. You didn't come. You don't get to come now because there's something worth looking at." Genevieve Whitcomb stood in the yard in the cold in the wrong shoes. "I never met him," she said. Tessa looked at her. "I married Marcus in 1981. Silas was already up here. Nobody explained it to me, and by the time I understood, there was something to explain I had learned not to ask." Her hands were folded in front of her the way they had been folded in that courtroom. "That is not an excuse. I'm aware of what it is." "What is it?" "It's the same thing." Genevieve's voice did not change at all, which was somehow the most honest thing about her. "I didn't ask, and then I benefited, and then it became easier not to ask, and then 20 years went by, and it was simply the shape of my life, and I did not think about it once. I want you to understand that. I did not lie awake about it. I never thought about him at all." Tessa said nothing. "You want me to say I'm sorry?" "I don't want anything from you," Tessa said. "That's the part I don't think you can get your head around. There's nothing you have." Genevieve looked at the shop. "The cello," she said. "I'd like to purchase it, not for the house, for the family, for continuity. It should be with people who share his name." And Tessa Moreau, who 8 months earlier had signed her own name 11 times in worsening handwriting, while 9 people watched, laughed out loud. "You don't want the cello," she said. "You want the story back." Genevieve's chin came up. "You want to be able to say the Whitcombs have his work. You want it in a display case in a hallway with a little brass plate so that when somebody brings this up at a dinner party in 6 years, you can say, 'Oh, we have one of grandfather's,' and it goes away." Tessa stood up. It's not going away. It's going in that shop with the other 10, and people are going to drive up this road and stand in that room, and I am going to tell them exactly what your family did out loud every Saturday for as long as I'm alive. For 1 second, Tessa would think about this second for years. Something moved across Genevieve Whitcomb's face. Not shame, recognition. The look of a woman who has just seen the pattern she has been standing in the middle of for 40 years and has understood that she is not the exception to it and never was. Then it closed. You'll have offers, she said. Serious ones. When you're ready to be practical, you'll find that most people are. Get off my land, Tessa said pleasantly. Genevieve Whitcomb went back to her car. She did not slam the door because she had never slammed anything in her life. And that was the last time the two of them were ever in the same place. Elias found the last 3 in January, and he found them because he finally stopped looking for hiding places and started looking at the tally marks. 11 cuts under the bench, grouped in fives, and he noticed what neither of them had noticed in 4 months, that the cuts were not all the same depth, and that 3 of them, the last 3, had a small notch beneath. He indexed them, he said. Tess, he indexed them. 3 of them are marked different because 3 of them are somewhere different. They were under the floor, not in a compartment under the sleepers, in the crawl space in a lead-lined box that Silas Whitcomb had built and buried, and then laid his own floor back over the top of, and getting it out took 2 days and cost them 4 floorboards that Elias replaced with such care that Tessa cried again and blamed the dust. Numbers 9, 10, and 11. Number 11 had no top plate. It was ribs and a back and a neck in a scroll, all finished, all perfect. And where the top should have been, there was nothing. And inside the ribs, glued to the block, was a small square of paper in handwriting that had gone thick and slow. For whoever they give it to, finish it. Tessa held that unfinished violin in both hands and did not say anything for a long, long time. He left it open, she said finally. He left it open. He could have finished it. He had 6 weeks after he wrote that entry. He had a top plate cut. It's up in that loft. I've seen it. Her voice went. He left it open on purpose. Elias Boone put his hand on the bench beside hers. Because a finished collection is a thing you inherit, he said. And an unfinished one is a thing you have to become somebody to deserve. The full appraisal came back in February, in a bound report 91 pages long, and Elias brought it up the hollow in his truck and sat on the porch step while she read it because he had figured out by then that she needed a person nearby and not a person talking. 11 instruments, 7 violins, 2 violas, a cello, and 1 unfinished violin cataloged as a study piece, plus the tools, plus the cured stock, plus the shop itself documented as an intact working atelier of a previously unrecorded American maker, with the maker's own journals establishing provenance for every single piece by number and date, $1.4 million. Tessa read the number and then read the sentence under it 3 times because the sentence was the part that actually landed. The committee notes that no comparable single-site survival of a complete American workshop and output is known. Dispersal of the collection would eliminate the majority of its documentary value. She set the report down on her knees. 1.4, she said. Elias whistled low. And if I sell it in pieces, it's furniture, she said. That's what that sentence means. Sell the cello to Chicago and the violins to 4 collectors, and the shop's just a building and the journals are just paper. And none of it means anything because the meaning is that they're all still in the room he made them in. You know there's going to be a lot of money in front of you in about 4 days. I know. There was. A private collector out of Virginia offered $400,000 for the cello alone, cash, no conditions, that same week, and did it by phone at 7 in the morning. And Tessa Moreau, who had $90 in September and had been working 3 overnight shifts a week at the county hospital in Harrison since October to keep the lights on, stood barefoot on a cold floor and said no. Ma'am, I want to make sure you understand the offer is $400,000. I understand it. May I ask why? She thought about it. It was the first time anyone had asked her that, instead of arguing with her, and she gave him a real answer. Because a man sat in this room for 33 years and finished 11 instruments and wrote "Nobody Heard It" on 10 of them, she said. And then he wrote down what he actually wanted, and it wasn't money, and it wasn't a museum, and it wasn't a collection in Virginia. He wanted them played out loud in front of people. That's the whole payment he asked for. I'm not going to be the 4th generation of this thing that decides it knows better than him. The man in Virginia was quiet for a moment. Would you take a call from me in a year, he asked. I'd take a call from you next Saturday, Tessa said. 9 to 2. Bring somebody who plays. She and Elias put the new roof on in March. He'd stayed. That was the plain fact of it, and neither of them had ever said a word about it out loud. He'd finished the county contract by filing a completion report that said the structure was owner-occupied and sound, which had cost him the county's slow season work permanently, and he had never once mentioned that to her, and she had found out about it from Darrell Pruitt in the hardware store. They worked well together, and they talked about almost nothing. That was the shape of it for 5 months. The turn came on at a Tuesday, and as I was so small that anybody watching would have missed it, she was trying to true the edge of the top plate for number 11. It was her fourth attempt. The first had cracked, the second had come out thick and dead, the third she'd gouged in the last 4 inches. After 2 weeks of work, and she had gone outside and put her forehead against the truck and not made any noise at all. The fourth was going the same way. She had the plane in her hands and the angle wrong, and she could feel it going wrong, and she held it out to him. Do it. Elias looked at the plane. He didn't take it. Elias, please. Just this one edge, I've been at it since. No, doll. Why, whoa? Because in about 10 years, you're going to be teaching somebody's kid to do this, he said. And when they ask you who made the top plate on Silas Whitcomb's last violin, I want you to be able to answer the question. Tessa stood there with a plane in her hands and her eyes streaming. I hate you, she said. I know. You're right, and I hate you. I know that too. She got it in April, not perfectly. The edge had a slight sweetness on the bass side that Elias said would change the sound, and refused to tell her whether it would change it for the better, but she got it with her own hands, 4 attempts and 11 weeks in. And that night she sat on the porch step next to him with the plate across her knees, and she said without looking at him, I want to be very clear about something. All right, I don't need you here. Elias took that. I've got the shop, I've got the title, I've got money coming from the tour donations and a job 3 nights a week and a lawyer who scares people. I am not in trouble anymore. She turned to him then. So if I ask you to stay, it isn't because I'm drowning. I want you to know that it isn't that, because I've been the drowning one, and I never want to be that again with anybody ever. Elias Boone was quiet for a second. Are you asking? I'm asking. He looked out at the road for a while. I quit a trade I loved at 25 because I decided I wasn't good enough for it, he said, and then I spent 10 years boarding up other people's buildings. And then a woman I'd never met yelled at me for putting 4 screws in a door frame. He shook his head. Yeah, I'm asking too. Adam came up once in May. He came up in a truck he'd bought for $1,800 because the family car had gone back with everything else. And he was working construction in Fort Smith, and he had lost about 15 pounds and had a farmer's tan, and looked, Tessa thought, more like a person than he ever had in a suit. I didn't come inside. He stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets the way he had stood in the parking garage 11 months earlier. And Tessa found that the echo did not hurt the way she'd expected. I'm not here for anything, he said. You said that last time. I meant it last time too. He almost smiled. I wanted to see it, that's all. She let him look. She did not offer to take him in. Do you ever think, he said after a while, about how none of this happens if they'd just given you the house, the real one, the Little Rock house? You'd have taken it, you'd have sold it, you'd be in an apartment somewhere, and Grandpa's whole life would still be inside a wall. Every day. They were so careful for 46 years, he said, and then they got greedy about $3. No, Tessa shook her head slowly. That's not what happened. They weren't greedy. They needed the record gone, and they needed somebody small enough to hand it to. They picked me because they were certain I'd fold. Adam looked at the shop. They were certain about a lot of things, he said. He left after 20 minutes. He asked at the truck door whether he could come back sometime, and Tessa said Saturdays 9 to 2, same as anybody, and he understood exactly what she was telling him and took it without complaint. She watched the truck go down the hollow and did not feel triumphant and did not feel sorry. She felt something more useful than either. He had walked through a door once at exactly the right moment at a price he understood in advance. That was worth being grateful for permanently. It was not worth being married for. Odessa Lindquist played the 1968 violin in Quill Creek Baptist Church on the last Sunday in May. The same church whose building fund had made her sit in a car for 20 minutes unable to turn the key. The same pastor introduced her, and he did it badly and it did not matter. She was 79 by then. She stood up in front of a room that had spent 46 years not saying a name, and she said, "This was made 2 miles up the hollow by a man most of you knew and all of you let alone." And then she played. There were people in that church who had refused to testify. Darrell Pruitt was in the third row and cried into his cap and did not care who saw. Charlene sat with her son from the county road department, and it was the son who came up afterward and asked Tessa whether the shop took visitors. And Tessa Moreau stood in the back of a church with her arms folded, listening to the first Whitcomb instrument ever played in public in 57 years, and thought about a note in an old man's handwriting glued inside a set of ribs. Finish it. She had for 4 months assumed he meant the violin. Standing in the back of that church, she finally understood that he had never once in 400 pages been talking about wood. He had meant the room. Tessa understood it walking out of that church into the parking lot with the sound still in her chest. Silas Whitcomb had not left an unfinished violin behind because he ran out of time. He had left a job in that building that could not be completed by one person alone, and he had known that whoever inherited it would have to become the kind of person who could do it, and that becoming was the actual inheritance. She opened the shop to visitors on the first Saturday in June. It started because Darrell Pruitt put a piece of poster board in his window without asking her. Harmon, he crossed that out and wrote Whitcomb Shop, Saturdays 9 to 2, up the hollow past the mile marker, free. Tessa found out about it on a Thursday and called him and said, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" And Darrell Pruitt said, "Making up for a Wednesday night," and hung up on her, which was the only time in his life he ever hung up on anybody. 9 people came the first Saturday. 41 came the second. By the fourth Saturday, she had to put cones on the gravel because 2 trucks had gotten wedged nose to nose on a road built for a mule, and Elias spent that whole afternoon backing strangers down a hollow, while Tessa stood in a one-room shop and told a story out loud to people who had driven 2 hours to hear it. She got better at telling it. That was its own quiet education. The first time she tried, she started with the courtroom, because the courtroom was the part that felt like a story, and she watched people's faces and understood halfway through that she was doing it wrong. So she started over. She started with a man arriving in a valley in 1954 with $400 and a wife named Ruth. She let people stand at the bench and put their own forearms in the dish that 33 years of leaning had worn into it. She showed them the 11 tally marks under it and let them count. She read them the entry about the maple he set back because he hadn't earned it yet, and she read them, nobody heard it, from the paper tucked under a leather cord, and by then she did not have to explain the rest, because by then there was not a person in that room still standing up straight. Only at the very end did she say the word deed. "There's a version of this where he's just a sad old man in the woods," she told them every week, standing in the same place. "That's not what he was robbed. It was done with a stamp and a signature by his own 2 sons, and it was legal for 46 years, and everybody in this valley knew and said nothing, including people who are standing in this room right now, and I say that in front of them because they asked me to." That last part was true. Charlene had asked her to. So had Darrell. So the children changed everything, and the children arrived by accident. A 7th grade teacher named Rosalind Cobb brought 14 kids up in a school van in September because the state history unit was a slog and she was desperate. Tessa nearly canceled. She had a hospital shift the night before, and she was running on 4 hours, and she did it anyway. And 14 12-year-olds sat on the floor of that shop for 50 minutes and did not touch their phones. At the end, a boy in the back put his hand up. Did he ever get to hear one? Tessa opened her mouth and could not answer. He wrote nobody heard it on 10 of them, she said finally. So he heard them. He played them alone in this room, and then he wrote down that nobody heard it, because a thing you only hear alone doesn't count. That's what he thought. The boy considered that with the total seriousness of a 12-year-old. "That's messed up," he said. "Yes. Can we hear one?" And Tessa Moreau, who had not planned it and had no business doing it, took the 1968 violin down off its wall mount and handed it to Odessa Lindquist, who happened to be sitting in the corner in a folding chair, the way she now happened to be sitting there every single Saturday, and an old woman played 8 bars of a hymn for 14 kids on a shop floor. 3 of them cried. One of them, a girl in the second row with her arms wrapped around her knees, did not make a sound and did not wipe her face and did not stop looking at that violin. Afterwards, she came up to Tessa and asked in a voice you could barely hear whether it was hard to learn to make one. Impossibly, Tessa said. The girl nodded and started to turn away. I'm doing it anyway, Tessa said. I'm terrible at it. I cracked 3 top plates before I got one. You want to come Saturdays and be terrible with me? The girl's name was June Alvarado, and she was 13 years old, and she said yes. That was how the workshop started. Not with a plan, with one kid who did not have a good reason to want it. They built the second bench in October, and Elias made her draw it first and then made her cut every mortise on it herself. She ordered beginner chisel sets from a supply house in Tennessee with money out of the donation jar, and she laid Silas Whitcomb's own tools on the wall above them so that a 13-year-old could see what 40 years of a master's hands had actually used and understand that they were nothing special. Worn handles a plane with a crack in the tote, a set of gouges sharpened down to about half their original length. That was the lesson she taught first and taught hardest every single time, because it was the one that mattered. He didn't have anything you don't have, she said. That's the whole thing. He had a room and some tools in 33 years and nobody clapping. That's all it ever takes, and that's why almost nobody does it. By December, there were 6 students. By spring, there were 11, which she noticed and did not mention to anyone. She taught from the journals. That was Silas Whitcomb's real curriculum, 400 pages of a man arguing with wood, and she read them the entries about grain direction and blade angle and the arch of a plate, and she read them the ones where he failed, which she came to believe were more important. July 1986, ruined the back for number 5, went too fast on the flame, sat outside 2 hours. There is no fixing it and no shortcut, and the only thing to do is start again on Monday. June Alvarado had that one written out and taped above her own bench inside of a month. Tessa finished number 11 in February, 14 months after she first put her hands on a plane. The top plate was her 4th. The graduation took her 9 weeks and she checked it with a caliper. Elias refused to hold for her. She cut the F-holes on a Sunday morning with her heart going so hard she had to stop twice because F-holes cannot be undone and everything before them dies with a slip. She set the sound post herself. It took her 40 minutes and it should take 4. The varnish was Silas's own recipe out of Journal 3, and it took 21 coats in 11 weeks, and she nearly lost the whole thing to a dust bloom in week 9 and did not sleep for 3 nights. And on a Tuesday in February, with Elias standing at the door, because she had asked him to stand at the door and not 1 inch closer, Tessa Moreau strung Silas Whitcomb's last violin and drew a bow across it. It was not beautiful. That was the first thing. It was rough and a little thin on the E string, and there was a wolf note down low that Elias found later and told her would take 3 or 4 years of playing to settle out. And it was not the sound that had come out of that 1968 instrument on a kitchen table and knocked a 78-year-old woman into a chair, but it spoke. It made a sound that had never existed in the world before and would not have existed if she had said yes to $4,000 or $11,000 or $400,000, or if she had folded in a courtroom, or if she had never lain down on her back on that floor at 2 in the morning out of pure stubbornness and looked up. Tessa lowered the bow. Say something, she said. It's not good, Elias said. I know it's not good. It's yours. He was not crying exactly, but it was near enough. Tess, it's yours. There's not another one of those on the planet. She sat down on the floor of that shop with an instrument in her lap and put her forehead against it. He wrote nobody heard it 11 times, she said. 10 times. 10. The 11th one he left open. Yeah, so that somebody could hear the first one. Odessa Lindquist died in April at 80 in her own bed 2 miles down the hollow. She had eaten dinner the night before at Tessa and Elias's table and complained about the salt. She had been at the shop the previous Saturday in her folding chair, with her cane across her knees, correcting June Alvarado's bow hold with the bluntness of a woman who had run a 6th grade classroom for 31 years and had no intention of softening in her last month. Tessa found her because Tessa checked on her every morning and had for a year and a half. The funeral was the largest anybody in that valley could remember. The church could not hold it, and they put speakers in the parking lot. And Tessa Moreau got up in front of that room in the same church and did the hardest 10 minutes of her life. "I want to tell you the true thing about Odessa Lindquist," she said, "and it isn't the nice one." The room went very still. She carried bread up a mountain to Silas Whitcomb on the first Saturday of every month for 29 years. Everybody knows that part. That part's easy. Her hands were shaking on the pulpit, and she let them. Here's the other part. She told me herself at her own kitchen table the second time we ever met. She said in 1979 she knew what had been done to that man, and she said nothing. For 46 years. And she said the reason was that it was legal, and that once a thing is legal, people find out they had nothing to say about it after all. Nobody in that church moved. She was the first person to stand up at that hearing after Adam. She was 78, and her church's building fund came out of the money that took that man's land, and somebody made sure she knew it, and she stood up anyway. Tessa looked out at them. "And every single one of you who stood up after her, you know what it cost you. Nothing. It cost you nothing because she went first." Darrell Prewitt was 3 rows back with his cap in his hands, red to the ears again. "That's what I want you to take out of this building today," Tessa said. "The first one pays for everybody. Somebody paid for you. Twice, once when a man walked up a mountain in 1979 and never came back down, and once when a 78-year-old woman stood up in a courtroom in October and asked her whole life to be worth less than a sentence." Her voice finally broke. "So when it comes around again, and it comes around, it's coming around somewhere right now, you go first. You go first, and you pay for the ones behind you, and that is how you say thank you to that woman, because flowers won't do it." She sat down. There was no applause, which was correct, and which she was grateful for the rest of her life. Odessa Lindquist left her the black student violin, the beat-up case she had pulled out of a hall closet on the second morning Tessa ever knew her, in a note that said, "Teach on it. It doesn't matter what it is, it matters that it's out loud." OL, it hangs on the shop wall between Silas's tools and the second bench. Every student in that valley learns bow hold on it. The offers never stopped. Tessa had assumed they would taper, and they never did. Chicago called twice a year. Virginia called and kept calling. And the man from Virginia, his name was Howard Bream, and he was 71 and had spent his life buying things, came up on a Saturday in the second year with a violinist from the symphony, the way she'd told him to, and stood in the back of a one-room shop with 40 strangers and did not say a single word about money. Afterward, he asked if he could speak to her outside. "I'm not selling the cello. I know that." He was quiet a second. "I've bought instruments for 40 years, and I have never once seen them played in the room where they were made. I didn't know that was a thing that could happen." He handed her a card. "I'd like to fund the workshop. Chisels, wood, whatever the kids need, no name on anything. I don't want a plaque, and I don't want a seat on anything, and if you say no, I'll go home and we'll never discuss it again." Tessa looked at the card. "Why, because I'm 71 and I've spent my life putting beautiful things in glass cases," Howard Bream said, "and I have just spent 50 minutes learning what that actually is." She said yes. The valley changed around the shop in ways nobody planned. The diner in Quill Creek went from opening 4 days to opening 7. Darrell Prewitt hired 2 people, which he had not done since 1998, and started stocking chisels and gouges and clamps because there were 9 households in that valley with a kid learning joinery. Somebody put a sign at the bottom of the county road. Somebody else fixed the worst 200 yards of gravel and would never admit who. Rosalind Cobb built a unit around it and taught it every fall, and the state took it and pushed it out to 4 counties. And by the 3rd year, there were 7th graders in Arkansas who could tell you what a defective notarial acknowledgement was and why it mattered, which Tessa considered the single most subversive thing she had ever accomplished. And the Whitcomb name went the way names go. Preston resigned from the last of his boards in the 2nd year quietly. The regional paper's 900 words got picked up and turned into 6,000, and then into a podcast, and then into a paragraph in a book about land title fraud in the post-war South, and the paragraph is still there and will be there after everyone involved is dead. The family kept the acres. They lost the thing the acres had been, for which was the ability to be respectable. Genevieve Whitcomb sold the lake property in the 4th year and moved to Dallas. Tessa heard about it from Darrell, who heard it from a cousin, and she found that she felt precisely nothing, which she took as a sign of something finally being finished. She never came back up the hollow. Tessa was glad. There was no version of that visit that would have been worth anybody's afternoon. Adam kept coming on Saturdays. He came maybe 4 times a year, and he never came inside during the tour, and he always stood at the back, like everybody else, and paid nothing and got nothing and left when it was over. In the third year, he brought a woman with him, and Tessa liked her immediately and was surprised by how uncomplicated that was. He caught Tessa at the trucks afterward. "I'm building houses," he said. "Actually building them. I've got a crew now, 6 guys." "That's good, Adam." I wanted to say he stopped and started over, which he did a lot now, and which she had come to understand was what honesty sounded like on a man who had spent 38 years never finishing a difficult sentence. That day in the courthouse. "Everybody thinks I did something brave. I didn't. I did the easiest thing I've ever done in my life because you'd already done all of it. You dug up the deed. You found the notary. You stood up first with nobody. All I had to do was walk into a room where the truth was already on the table." Tessa looked at him for a long moment. "That's true," she said. He laughed. "You were supposed to argue." "No," she smiled a little. "You did the second hardest thing, and the second hardest thing is what most people never do either. But you're right about who paid. That's Odessa's rule, and it's Silas's rule, and it's the whole thing I teach in there." She nodded at the shop. "The first one pays. Everybody after pays less. That's not a reason to feel bad about being second. It's a reason to know what it costs the one in front of you." She signed the trust in the 5th year. Her lawyer in Fayetteville drafted it, and Tessa rewrote the operative clause 3 times because the first 2 versions read like law, and she wanted it to read like a person. The Quill Creek, and everything in it, 11 instruments, 4 journals, the tools, the cured stock, the ledgers, the black student and violin. The building itself could not be sold mortgaged, borrowed against, broken up, or moved. Not by her, or not by anybody after her. She wrote herself out of the ability to change her own mind on purpose because she had learned exactly how a family talks itself into being practical. Open Saturdays, free, forever. And a single clause at the end, in plain English, that made her lawyer put down her pen and stare at her. It passes to whoever needs it next. Not blood, not name. The trustees will know her when she comes up the road because she'll look like I did. You can't write that. Watch me. Tessa, a court. A court'll figure it out, Tessa said. I've had a pretty good run with courts. The girl came up the hollow on a Saturday in October in the 6th year. It was 10 in the morning and the tour had already started, and Tessa heard the car before she saw it because it was the kind of car you hear something loose in the front end, the engine running on a wish. It stopped at the edge of the gravel and did not park properly, and a young woman got out and stood beside it and did not come any closer. 22, maybe 23. A jacket too thin for October in the Ozarks. And the back seat of that car was packed to the roofline with everything she owned, which Tessa knew from 30 feet away, because there is a particular way a car sits when it is somebody's whole life. Tessa left 40 people standing in a shop and walked out into the yard. The girl's chin came up in a way Tessa recognized so completely that it took the breath out of her because it was the exact motion she had made in a parking garage 6 years earlier, deciding she was not going to cry where anybody could see. Is it free? The girl asked. The sign said free. If it's not free, I'll go. It's free. Okay. She didn't move. I read about it in a paper, in a diner, in Tulsa. She swallowed. It said somebody's family gave her a house worth $3 because they thought she was nothing. That's right. Is that true? Yes. The girl stood there in a thin jacket with her hands jammed in the pockets. They took my grandmother's house, she said, and her voice went completely flat, the way voices go when a person has told themselves 100 times that they are fine. My stepfather did. She signed something. She thought it was, I don't know what she thought it was. She was 81. And I went to 3 lawyers, and all 3 of them said the same thing. Her jaw worked. They said it was legal. Tessa Moreau stood in her own yard and felt 6 years of her life close into a circle. Have you eaten? She asked. The girl blinked. What have you eaten today? And that was where the chin finally went, and she put her hand over her face and stood in a stranger's yard and came apart. No, not since no. Tessa did not touch her. She had learned that from Elias Boone on a loft floor a long time ago. She waited it out. She waited until the girl was done, And then she said, "There's a cot in the back room. It's not much, but it's warm and the door locks from the inside. You can stay a night or a week or the winter, and nobody will ask you for anything and nobody will ask you to explain yourself." The girl wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "Why?" "Because a man I never met built this place for somebody exactly like me," Tessa said, "and he never knew my name, and he sat in that room for 33 years knowing there would be a next one. And there was, and now there's you." She nodded toward the shop. "Come inside. I'm in the middle of telling the story. You should hear it from the beginning." "I don't have anything." "You've got a grandmother's house that somebody took with a piece of paper," Tessa said, "and 3 lawyers who told you it was legal, and you drove 400 miles anyway. That's everything. That's what I had." The girl looked at her for a second. "What's in there?" she asked. And Tessa Moreau, 24 years old, in a conference room, $90 to her name in a state archive, alone in a courtroom with a manila folder and 41 people not standing up behind her, put her hand on the door that Silas Whitcomb had cut by hand for a house nobody was ever supposed to visit, and pushed it open. "Come see," she said. They had measured a man's whole life at $3 because not one of them ever walked through that door. Silas Whitcomb spent 33 years building the proof, sealed it in the walls, and left the key with the only person his family was careless enough to underestimate. Tessa Moreau found it, kept every piece of it together, taught an entire valley to play it out loud, and put it in writing that it goes to whoever needs it next. The Whitcombs kept the land. Tessa kept the truth. And that shop is still open on Saturdays, and it is still free, and the sound coming out of it is never going quiet again.